Well, isn't Trump blowing it? I mean, he's completely gone out of his mind with this Doge stuff. Everything's turned up to 11. He may crash the economy. Is he going too far too fast? And is this just going to break apart the populist energy in the United States? Well, hello out there in podcast land. Welcome to a new edition of the Liberal Patriot Podcast. I'm your host, Rui DeSharon. I come at you every couple of weeks with the very finest and heterodox conversation and analysis with the most interesting and stimulating guests. And today I'm extremely happy to have Henry Olsen with us. Now, Henry has perhaps dubious honor of being the second guest we've had, or the first guest, or whatever. You know what I'm saying. He's the first person to appear twice on this here podcast. So congratulations, Henry, for what that's worth. But I'm delighted to have you back.
Well, no, I'm delighted to be back, and I'm just trying to think of how to remake that old W.C. Fields joke work in my favor.
There you go. So Henry, for those of you who don't know, he's a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's the author of The Working Class Republican, Ronald Reagan and the Return of Blue-Collar Conservatism. And here's a news flash for y'all. You can buy the Kindle edition today for a limited time only of his book for $2.99 on Amazon. So, the moment you finish listening to this podcast, you should get on the Amazon website and buy your edition of that particular excellent book. Now, Henry currently writes for National Review, New York Post, and Unheard. He's written for many outlets over time, and he's, in my view, one of the most astute political analysts, period, and certainly stands out among those who tend to lean toward the right side of the political spectrum. So there's a lot to talk about these days, a lot happening in politics land and conservatism land and populism land. So maybe we'll start out by asking you something you've written a lot about. Are we in a populist era today? And if so, why? Outline your view on sort of where we are in historical time.
Yeah, we are in a populist era. The wish that the elites on all sides of the oceans have had for over a decade, that we're in a populist moment that will fade, either because the elites, the existing powers, will solve problems, or because people will wake up and see the error of their ways. They'll stop being seduced by the Pied Piper of populism. There's about as much chance of that as my dating Paris Hilton. And the reason,
you never know, Henry. Don't give up hope.
Paris, are you listening? My fiance would be very upset if I did.
Yeah. Don't do it.
But the reason why I think are pretty obvious, which is that we entered the 21st century with a big expectation that the West had triumphed, that we were going to have Western values, Western economy, spread throughout the world effortlessly. It was the moment of the end of history that Francis Fukuyama popularized. And now we're a quarter century in, and it don't look so hot. Millions of people, tens of millions of people have found that globalization has meant the destitution of their communities and greater reliance on public subsidy to maintain a constantly under threat standard of living. You've had progressive values move so rapidly that in 1996, Bill Clinton could sign the Defense of Marriage Act, saying that the federal government cannot recognize same-sex marriage, to the point where one major political party cannot even talk about it in any sort of way, because same-sex marriage and homosexuality has been pushed from tolerance to, if you're not fully accepting of it, you are some sort of illiberal. And that's not to talk about trans ideology and other sorts of things that, whether they are indiscriminately right or wrong, is not the point. The point is that we have had a rapid change in mores about things so that people who aren't 100% on board with the change are often feeling unsettled or angry about it. Take a look at J.K. Rowling. This is a woman who's so far in the liberal camp, social democratic camp, that if you carefully read the Battle of Hogwarts, you'll note that it takes place 1 year to the day after Tony Blair's defeat of the Conservatives, which, given that she was a £1 million donor to the Labour Party at that time, is not an accident, as
Perhaps not a
my friends
coincidence.
on the
Yeah.
Marxists might say. And
Right.
yet, of course, because she actually says a woman's body has some basis in biology, she's been called a TERF, canceled, and has been under assault. And that tells you how rapidly things have changed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then you have the question of geopolitics, which was that in 2001, people thought that Russia would become part of a peaceful European Union and that China would democratize. Well, hello, McFly. Neither of those things have happened. So across the board, all of the elite assumptions have failed, and none of the elites in the Atlantic or the North American or the Asian spheres have really come to grips with this. Basically, what we continue to get is trust us, whereas people who have watched Animal House might say that the real attitude is you bleeped up, you trusted us, flounder, as they wreck the car. And that's the seed of populism, is that populism is the recognition that the global order that promised peace, peace, prosperity, and social harmony have produced conflict, large segments of hardship, and social discord. And they don't like it, they don't want it, and they're not going to put up with it anymore.
Well, granted all that, let's say, for the sake of argument, that the liberal establishment, the conventions on both left and right have been battered.
Right. It's important to say that this transcends the old left-right divide.
Right,
This
exactly.
is why is it that the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal hate Trump's tariffs? It's because it goes directly at the economic basis of this order.
Right. So, granting that for a second, but what about the other side of it, which is that can the populist actually govern? I mean, you were pretty optimistic. You were making some pretty bold predictions in a great article you wrote for the Liberal Patriot on the German elections. It's called Germany and the Future of National Populism. Everyone should go out immediately and read it. It's a great article. And you were prognosticating that national populism would really be not only the opposition that's battering against these ramparts, but would really be the dominant political tendency moving into the future. That, in fact, I think at one point in the article you said what social democracy was to the 20th century, national populism would be for the 21st century. So can you justify that in terms of, populism hasn't really governed much yet, and where it has governed, it hasn't been hugely successful. So how can you make such a bold prediction?
Well, first of all, that was said about social democracy in the 20th century. Before social democratic governments took power, which is to say their adherents were attacked as communist and anti-democratic, and great predictions of chaos and destruction came. And what you found was that social democrats were actually reasonable people. Yes, they dramatically changed their countries, but what made them social democrats rather than communists was a reasonableness. So that what you found was New Zealand, after the welfare state that labor puts in the 1930s, actually turns out to work. The Canadian Liberal Party is not openly social democratic, but it basically moves in that direction. And Canada remains, prosperous and free. British Labour Party socializes lots of industry. And by the 1950s, the Conservatives have accepted almost all of those change, and they run the 1959 election saying, you've never had it so good. Well, that was right. It was the best economy many people had, and the Social Democrats hadn't screwed it up. So what do we see with populists? Well, the fact is populists haven't governed very much, but show me where they've governed from a national populist perspective where things have screwed up. Donald Trump's economy in the first term was the best working class people had seen in 20 years. Uh, Viktor Orban has managed to oversee until very recently, a growing and expanding Hungarian economy.
Hmm.
The populists who have contributed to center-right governments in Scandinavia have not screwed up their countries, and in fact, in some places, forced the left. I'm thinking of Denmark and their social
Yeah,
democrats
Denmark's
to
a very
adopt their
interesting example.
policies on migration. So,
Hmm.
the question is, I'm not interested in how populists in 1943 in Argentina screwed up their countries. Show me where populists of the center right who have governed have screwed things up in the last decade. I don't think you can find a single place.
Yeah, yeah. No, we're not talking about the return of Juan Perón on a global scale. Thank God for that. Um, well, okay. Let's deal with the U.S. a little bit later because obviously it'll be a focus of significant discussion here and everywhere else as we try to figure out what the hell's going on. But let's look at some of the European countries specifically where the
Hmm.
populists have risen in a big way. So let's start with Germany, which you talked
Yeah.
about in the article that I alluded to. Now, the situation now in Germany is I guess we got another grand coalition here headed by Friedrich Merz between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. What's your prognosis for that? And will they succeed over time in keeping the AfD out of government forever? Which, again, a lot of people, you talk to people on the left here in a lot of places, they'll say, "Oh, well, of course that has to be true forever because these people are basically Nazis, and it'd just be a total end of the world if that cordon sanitaire was breached."
There's absolutely no example where a grand coalition has succeeded in stemming populism. We've had grand coalitions in Germany over the last 15 years, and over that time, we've gone from having no national populist party to the AfD that got over 20% in the last election, and in a poll that was just released as we're recording earlier this morning, our time, afternoon, German time, there's yet
Hmm.
another poll that says the AfD is now the most popular party in Germany. We can take a look at the Danish situation a couple of years ago. Traditionally, Scandinavian politics are, a Marxist stream. They literally still call the right the bourgeois parties. You had a red bloc and a blue bloc, and Mette Frederiksen, the Danish prime minister, surprised people by breaking with that after her red bloc won the election, and she formed a grand coalition with her leading opponent, the center-right Venstre, and a breakaway from that, the moderates of a former Venstre prime minister. Today, that coalition sits at between 35 and 38% of the polls, and both sides have seen defections. The center-left Social Democrats have seen defections to their farther left, so that now the combined total of the Socialist People's Party and the unreconstructed far left unity list is almost as much as the Social Democrats, and it's shifted to the populist and the neo-libertarian right. So you look and you say they did this to solve social problems, and instead the next Danish election is going to make it impossible to form that coalition again because people look and they say, we don't want this bland centrism. So I take a look and I say, why do I think that Friedrich Merz's grand coalition is going to succeed where Austria's failed, where the Netherlands failed, where the French attempt at a grand coalition has failed continually over the last year? They can't even get a majority in parliament to back a government repeatedly. And why do I think this one is going to succeed where every other one has failed and the populist strength has only risen? The only thing that has stopped populist parties' rise in polls is letting them into government as part of a coalition. That works in Scandinavia. Is that when they actually have to take responsibility for governing, they stop going up. But you also don't get crazy politics. You get a movement in a populist direction, but but people aren't put into concentration camps. The economy doesn't collapse. Uh, all of these things that are supposed to happen when you let populists into government don't happen. But amazingly, people start treating them like normal parties because they are treated as normal parties. So I take a look at Germany and I think AfD is already basically tied with them. I'd be very surprised if they were not close to 30% within 18 months' time.
Yeah. So speaking of that German government, what concretely, what do they propose to do? Right? I mean, you've got this grand coalition government. You've got the MERS.
Right.
I mean, I don't see MERS mania out there anywhere in Germany. It doesn't seem like anyone has any faith in what this government is going to do. Do they have any clue, any hint of a program to deal with the incredible problems that Germany and the German economy has today?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. What Merz basically did was weaken his stand on migration to appease the Social Democrats in order to get tax cuts for business and
Hmm.
spending for defense. And the Social Democrats essentially get also a lot of spending on green projects and infrastructure, and I think a hike in the minimum wage as well. And so you look at this and you say, well, if tax cuts on business and massive public spending program is going to solve the ills of Germany, well, maybe they can succeed. But they basically are going to be punting on the question of culture, which is very important on the right and to populist voters.
Hmm.
And it's not clear that this sort of policy is going to produce some sort of massive economic quick recovery, which is what Germany basically needs. Germany bet on Russian energy and Chinese markets. And
Hmm.
those are really bad bets after the invasion of Ukraine. And I don't, maybe opening up the borrowing spigot, which is what they're going to do, will produce enough of a sugar high that things will change. But the basic long-term growth of Germany can't come from rebuilding bridges and outfitting homes with heat pumps and so forth.
Right.
It has to come from a private sector that compete for consumer goods that don't get shipped to Beijing. And it's not at all clear to me that Merz's policy is going to work, at least within the 4-year time frame that politics dictates.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the underlying issue of energy prices too, and the relationship of that to industry, it doesn't seem like anything's going to change because oddly, the Social Democrats still retain, they've been so infected by the ideology promoted by the Greens and the Green sector of German politics, they seem completely incapable of giving up on that stuff, which is weird given everything that's happened with the German economy in the
Yeah,
last period
well,
of
yeah,
time.
and this is the thing though, is that if if the center right has been pushed by the populist right, the center left has been pushed by the populist left and the green left.
Hmm.
And it's very difficult for them to say no because many of their voters will migrate to those parties. Uh, but the problem is if you say yes, then you're beholden to those parties. And the Social Democrats there's really no center left party in the world that has really solved this problem. Um, and consequently, you take a look and you say, Social Democrats have done what they've done, and that basically means they'll be satisfied with 15% of the vote ad infinitum, and perhaps even less if their tenure in government makes people decide that they're going to take extremes. One of the telling things about the German election was that the two biggest parties among young voters were the populist far left, what was the left, the former communists,
Yeah, the left. Yeah.
and the AfD, the populist right, and the populist left, the BSV by
Hmm.
Bundesrat was also popular. The legacy parties were basically completely discredited among the young. What is it that makes you think grand coalition with your opponents is going to convince them to come back?
The definition of insanity, right? Trying the same thing again when it hasn't worked
But
before,
that's what's
over
been
and over.
going on in the West for 25 years.
Yeah, yeah.
What is it that we need? It's kind of like that old Saturday Night Live, Theodore Kavyark medieval barber, where Steve Martin keeps bleeding the patient.
Right, right. That's a good metaphor. Well, let's move on from Germany to France because we do have some interesting political developments there. Some debates are sparking off, where you have the most popular politician in the country barred from running again. So where are we now on that? I mean, Marine Le Pen famously, because of a court decision having to do with some sort of corruption thing,
Right.
saying, "Oh no, you can't run again." And I think there was some maneuvering after that. So where are we now, and what's that all about? I mean, it seems like kind of an extraordinary development.
It is an extraordinary development, and it basically is a claim that I think it was 2014, that when she was a member of the European Parliament, she and members of her party used funds from the European Union to fund political activity, which they may well have done. One of the claims that her defenders say is, but everybody does it in Strasbourg, everybody does it in Brussels.
Probably true.
And with the French political system, what you have to understand is that French parties get a lot of their money from annual subsidies based on the number of people they have in the National Assembly. And because of their system, her party would get a lot of votes, but very few seats, and hence were starved of funds. And there was a cordon sanitaire on banks that basically the government and the officials said, don't lend money to this party. So they got loans from Russian banks, and apparently they diverted money here to keep the party alive. And a court found her guilty and said she can't run again. Now, supposedly this is going to be dealt with on appeal in 2026, so she might be if the court rules differently, the appeals court, she could stand in the 2027 presidential election. But I'll note two things. One is that polls that have been taken since then show that her 29-year-old heir, Jordan Bardella, would basically get the same share of the vote. In other words, there's very little personal vote for Marine Le Pen. It's a rightist vote. So they've stretched the law or applied the law selectively, if you take the populist argument, and get no political benefit from it.
Couldn't it even backfire? I mean, if
Well,
you're Jordan Bardella and you're the replacement candidate, you can make a lot of hay out of the fact they're doing everything they can to keep us, your representatives, the people who represent your opinions, out of government. This is outrageous. We must stand up and fight, etc.
And I wouldn't be surprised over time if that's exactly what does happen, is that you see immediately we did not see the day after gain in the polls. But what we see, that could very well be exactly what happens. And then you've got the fact that the decision of Macron to dissolve the assembly and have a special election has basically created instability, is that his own party is a coalition of three parties, or his centrists, and they don't have a majority. And the left is a coalition of at least four parties, ranging from the center left all the way over to the far left. And Macron won't make an arrangement with them. And so they're trying to put together a centrist coalition where you go from the center-right Republicans, the remnants of the old center-right, over to the center-left Democrats, the two parties that have been destroyed by the current upheaval. And they have to agree, both of them, on whatever the centrist government wants to do. And you look at that and you say, this is a grand coalition that's even worse than a grand coalition in Germany, because they can't agree on what to do. And I expect that what we'll have is another dissolution of the election. And if Macron wanted to really risk things, he would resign as president and have a special presidential election to block Le Pen. But I don't think Macron will want to give up his last 2 years in power. But so you have a situation where they've committed basically an own goal by trying to put somebody in jail for dubious reasons that is at best not helping them, and at worst could really hurt them, against the backdrop of an unstable government that's highly unlikely to last the year. Other than that, Mrs. Macron, how is the play?
Right. This is what we technically call a big mess.
Yes.
So let's go across the channel here to the UK and talk a little bit about what's happening there, because I've been fascinated to follow the vagaries and fortunes of the Labour government after their resounding, not popular vote, but representative dominating Parliament because of the decline of the Conservatives, of the Tories. And they seem to be rapidly making themselves incredibly unpopular, right? I mean, and it seems like the Labour Party had no real idea what it was going to do when it got into government to, in a sense, to go back to something we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, you're in a populist age. Britain's in a populist era. What is your response to that, Mr. and Ms. Labour Party? And it seemed like they have no response. I mean, the biggest economic program they seem to have is this kind of bizarre green energy thing that Ed Miliband has been put in charge with before I guess they get around to kicking him out because he's so unpopular. But I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? I mean, what are they trying to do here? And if you
They
look
don't
at
know what they're trying to do. Essentially, the thing is that center-left parties in first-past-the-post systems like America are uneasy coalitions between the far left and the center-left. You can't win without the far left. But as Jeremy Corbyn showed, if you give in to the far left, you also can't win. So basically what Sir Keir Starmer did was produce a bland centrism that was not working until the Tories imploded before their very eyes. Right. So they were essentially running as we're not the Tories.
And they aren't.
And they aren't.
Is that enough?
Well, but that's the thing is that they didn't have a clear sense, because to have a clear sense meant to divide their party. Mm-hmm. And they're already the most unpopular government in the first year in British history. They're down to 24% in the polls. They only got 32 or 33%. That's right. And polls now show that it would be a three-way race between Nigel Farage's Reform Party, the remnant of the old Conservatives, and Labour, with fourth and fifth and sixth parties taking up the rest of the vote. The last poll that came out over the weekend, it's called a MRP poll, multi-level regression stratification poll, which you poll tens of thousands of people and find demographic features and then project that across the demographies of these 650 districts. And what they find is that Reform, with 24% of the vote, would be the largest party in Parliament. Now, because of the massive parliamentary majority in the first-past-the-post system, Keir Starmer is going to be able to serve out his 5-year term. But he's already facing political disaster. And they're going to have the local elections on May 1st. And a by-election in a seat that Labour carried by over 30 points. Both MRP polls that have come out in the last month say that if the parliamentary election were held today, they would win Reform would win that seat. Mm-hmm. So people are going to be looking at that seat. But one of the things I was looking at was Britain has these local elections. Reform will gain hundreds of seats. Labour will lose seats. The Tories will lose seats. But there's a few places that elect mayors by first past the post.
Okay.
And so I was looking and saying, gee, I wonder how this conservative convert and Dame Andrea Jenkins, who's running for Reform in a place called Lincolnshire, would do. So I looked at the MRPs, and every constituency save one in Lincolnshire is predicted to vote for Reform.
Wow.
Okay, well, if that applies at a local election, Andrea Jenkins will be the mayor of Lincolnshire. But wait, there's more, McFly. Yeah, there's the Labour bastion of Kingston upon Hull, which is a depressed old city. Mm-hmm. There's a former gold medalist from the British Olympic team running for Reform. And there are 6 constituencies in this mayoralty area. Reform would win, depending on the MRP, 5 or 6 of them. Wow. What happens if this kid wins?
Yeah.
But wait, there's more. There's the city of Doncaster, another depressed red wall town, for those who are in the know. Basically runs over 3 constituencies. And the MRPs suggest that Reform would win 2 or 3 of those. What happens if Reform wins all 3? Now, I'm not predicting they'll win all 3, but what I am telling you is that if you look at the MRPs and local elections go with the MRPs, you would have to say Reform would win safe Labour, safe Tory seats and mayoralities, and that will destroy British politics forever.
Well, I mean, not
May
destroy,
1st,
I mean, change
that's when the vote takes place.
Yeah.
and they will count the results over May 2nd and May 3rd. So by May 4th, Star Wars Day, May the 4th be with you, we may very well see the 4th or the Force helping Nigel Farage, the return of the British Jedi.
Yeah, well, all that's certainly very consistent with your basic thesis about the rise of national populism.
Yep.
Obviously, people thought when Labor won their big victory, this would like stem the tide. Obviously, it hasn't. The very reverse has taken place. And for those who might be a little skeptical of some of Henry's predictions here, I would take them pretty seriously. I mean, this is the guy who said right before our most recent election, he predicted confidently that Trump would win the Electoral College and said very likely would win the popular vote as well. And guess what happened? It turned out to be exactly the case. So those inclined to raise a skeptical eyebrow at Henry on this might want to think again. I mean, this guy keeps pretty close track of things, and he has good instincts about political trends and directions. We would be remiss then if we did not, after taking this brief tour of the continent and the sceptered isle, go to the U.S.
Yeah.
Because we have a populist president. I mean, the instantiation of the populist trend in our own country, where we have, by virtue of having the two major party systems, I mean, in a sense, the populists were able to take over one of the main parties, and they took over and they won 2 out of the last 3 elections. So, but I think the first thing probably people would ask of you as a sort of, not exactly an apostle, I guess, but as a sympathetic observer and somewhat promoter of this trend, well, isn't Trump blowing it? I mean, he's completely gone out of his mind with this Doge stuff. Everything's turned up to 11. He may crash the economy. Granted, he had he certainly had the wind at his back when he won the election. I mean, clearly he was speaking to the median American voter in a language they understood, and they said, we're mad as hell. We're not going to take it anymore. We're going to let Trump and his buddies have a try. But is he going too far too fast? And is this just going to break apart the populist energy in the United States?
So he may be going too far too fast. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm. When you read the elite media, and that includes elite media on the right, there's been this sense for a decade that Trump has jumped the shark. Well, the shark is now wearing a red MAGA hat and showing up at rallies. The thing is that his demise has been forecast so many times erroneously that it's very difficult for me to immediately say, well, of course he has. Here's what I think. Okay. First of all, for all of what you've been reading about since Liberation Day, Donald Trump's approval rating has gone down 1.5 points in the Real Clear Politics average. That's not great. It's not a disaster either. Okay. He's sitting at 46.5% approval rating. If he gets that on Election Day in 2026, Republicans will still hold control of the Senate. They might pick up a seat on that. They'll lose control of the House, but they probably would lose control of the House anyway. It's not great, but it's actually not bad. What we know is that for all of the talk about the stock market tanking, it seems to gyrate back and forth, and it is not even yet in bear territory. And what we know is that Trump does seem to be oscillating between fan service, the stuff that he does to make the base happy, and stuff that will make his center happy. Donald Trump is president because 8% of Americans on election day didn't like him or Harris, but they chose him by 20 points.
Right.
The more he focuses on the base and the less he focuses on them, the likelihood that his job approval rating is like 44 or 45% increases. And if he doesn't have, if the economy is running slow or in a mild recession, I think he's political enough not to drive the economy into the cliff for the sake of ideology. That could be worse, but let me put it in historical context. In April 1981, the Dow Jones Industrial Average closed at 1,042. In by September of 1981, it was at 824. It's a 20% decline. And in fact, at a time of double-digit inflation, the real decline was more than that. It was more like 25%. Of course, I'm talking about Ronald Reagan, the last person who tried to completely change the global economy. The market then stayed the same way for about a year. It went down another 4 or 5% until it started to recover in August of 1982. He had a job approval rating of 37% in December of 1982, and he was trailing Democratic test candidates in the polls. Well, we all know what happened.
Yeah, didn't
Ronald
he win
Reagan
that
won the
election
last
in
real
1984?
landslide and ushered in the Reagan era
I seem to
because,
recall that. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, you and I are old enough, we actually lived through it. Some of your whippersnapper people, they
Yeah.
might say, wait a
The
minute, you mean
old his.
kind of like with, Dr. Brown on Back to the Future. Ronald Reagan, the actor, um,
That
as
happened.
president?
Yeah.
But so the thing is that Margaret Thatcher was the same thing. Not the stock market didn't kill her, but 1982, she did not look like she was going to win a second term. But we are now going through the anniversary of the reconquest of the Falklands. The fleet was going south during the month of April in 1982, and that victory sent her popularity soaring, and she won a second term and broke the unions in the next couple of years and brought in the Thatcher era. The thing is that people change. Short-term defeat does not mean long-term defeat. And there's such a desire to say populism is spent, populism is stupid, populism is this, that there is not enough willingness to say there is a wide variety of possible outcomes, of which my dream scenario, the end of populism, is only one. And based on what we've seen over the last 15 years, probably a minority sense, as opposed to a majority sense. But yeah, Trump could be sinking himself. We'll find out over the next few months. But even if he sinks himself in 2025 or early 2026, it does not mean anything for 2028. Then we have to see how they react to their problems and their mistakes.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the Reagan rebound scenario is not completely implausible. On the other hand, as you're implicitly saying, it's not for sure either, any more than
Right.
the end of populism is for sure. I mean, if you were to believe a lot of the economic prognosticators out there on the Democratic leaning side, I mean, they're not just talking about a short-term decline in the U.S. economy. They're talking about a complete, unmitigated, cataclysmic disaster. So if that is the case, if it's more than just a sharp downturn even, then I think all bets are off. But if it's, a downturn, mild, moderate, even fairly severe, but with a quick rebound, then I think things are very different. And I think, as you're also essentially saying, none of us know what the true
Yeah.
case is going to be. It's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. So, the takeaway here, I guess, is you may think Trump's sinking himself, and he may, but you don't know that for sure, and you better
Right.
stay tuned in. What would you say then about how this is playing in sort of the right of center conservative world, in that broad coalition that is, constitutes that part of our political spectrum? It seems to me, while there might have been some possibility of sort of realignment within the conservative movement in the direction that you're kind of favoring or think is really in the offing, I think some of the way that Trump has governed has kind of blown that up, has it not? I mean,
Well,
we
it's
do
made
see
it harder.
yeah.
Is that what we're finding is that there's a very large element of the Republican Party, and even some who self-style themselves as MAGA people, who are really committed to the old order.
Okay.
And,
Well, what do you mean by the old order?
what I
What's the old
mean
order mean?
is the on this matter, there are a lot of people in the Trump coalition who are effectively unreconstructed old guard Republicans. They don't want globalization upended. They're willing to go along with some other stuff, but they don't want government subsidies to bring manufacturing back. They don't really want to help the people who have been laid off. They don't. they'll put up with deportations, but if you come after my business and make sure that I'm only hiring legal people, well, that's an unconscionable burden. You raise a couple of points on my income tax, that's going to be the end of the world. I fail to see why a 2-point rise or 2.5-point, 3-point rise in people who make more than $1 million a year will destroy the private sector economy, but a 10% tariff can't bring jobs back to the United States. If 3% incentives are really bad, won't 10% incentives change behavior? And this just gets to how much of this is ideology and faith, not anything based on evidence. But Trump really screwed up the rollout of the tariffs. What Reagan did was have a clear sense. He was willing to negotiate on details, so a 30% proposed tax cut became a 25% tax cut, but the direction was always clear. And Trump's penchant for deal making is hurting him politically because he's not providing that sort of clear direction that enables him to form a political coalition for the long term and also to build support for, perhaps a downturn in the economy. So I think that has exacerbated the fact that his coalition, he has decided to strike exactly at the point where his coalition is most unstable, which is the question of should the government work to change the economic system to help native-born Americans who have not graduated from a 2 or 4-year college degree. His populist wing says yes. The new voters who joined him in 2016, 2020, and 2024 largely say yes. The old voters presented with this are saying no. I didn't think the leopards would eat my face. I don't support this. And Trump's not managing it very well. And I think he's going to have to manage it better. But the coalition is not going to fall apart because there's nothing that the Democratic Party is doing that makes either side feel more comfortable in the Democratic coalition. So eventually they'll have to figure out a way forward that they'll both be unhappily married, but they'll be married because divorce is really not an option for either side, given where the Democratic Party is.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think one could certainly make the argument that despite all the potential for populism or national populism in this country, that Trump could be, while he was uniquely suited to mobilize a lot of those energies, particularly in the context of our electoral system, he also might be uniquely suited to make it fall short of its potential by some of the intemperate ways he governs and how he deals with some of the moderates in and around his own coalition. And Yuval Levin and I wrote I thought, a pretty good report the other day called Politics Without Winners, where we were basically arguing that neither side seems to be particularly capable or oriented toward forming a true durable majority coalition. I mean, clearly, I thought after Trump won his victory, he had a shot at it, but the way things have gone, one has to wonder about that. But the other side of this, of course, and we must discuss this before we conclude this tour of the populist world. The Democrats. Do they have a clue? Tell me, Henry, do they even know we're living in a populist age? Have they gotten the message?
No. Is that the left-wing populists, like left-wing populists everywhere, think that this is essentially a Marxist solution, and they ignore the cultural issues. You write movingly and persuasively on this almost on a weekly basis. So, I take a look and I think none of them have got the wisdom of the Danish Social Democrats that say in order to win on the economic issues and even to advance a green agenda, we have to work to gain trust from our voters on the cultural issues. So I look at the Democratic left and I say, you have no clue. And then I look at the Democratic center, and the Democratic center remains unwilling to recognize the precarious situation that they are in, which is to say they have not confronted the left for well over a decade. And they're in a position now where the left is so dangerous that the fight will be much more bloody than had they done it in 10, 12, 14 years ago. they recognize the strategists that a lot of the leftist cultural leanings and some of their economic leanings are really a drag on them. But none of them are willing to make the stand that the New Democrats made 30 years ago and say, and we're not going to do it. They're trying to get around it with messaging and so forth. And I look at this, this isn't going to fly. You can't dance with a tiger and expect that you're going to have a minuet. It's just not there. And then you have the problem that I keep asking my friends in the Democratic Center on this show is how they want to deal with, which is that let's say you want to have a Democratic centrist who is the nominee. Not somebody like a Pete Buttigieg, who is effectively a center-left character, but you want to have somebody who can authentically talk to the center of America. Self-described moderates are about 35 to 40% of the Democratic primary electorate. They're a single largest faction, but they're short of a majority. But they're disproportionately African American. So I always ask people, which Democratic centrist do you see exciting the African American vote? Because that's the challenge. If you can't do it, then you can't win the nomination. And none of them have an answer to that. And so I look at this and I say, the people who see the problem don't want to be populist enough, and they don't want to challenge their left. So I actually think that it's increasingly likely that a full-throated left-wing populist, like an AOC, will be the nominee. Of course, it's 3 years out and lots of things can change, blah, blah, blah. But I don't see either a person or an institution that sees either challenge accurately enough and is willing to make the hard choices that you need to make in order to make that strategy fly. Which then means that if that's the case, we'll see a quote-unquote surprise left-wing victory. Surprise only because the last people to understand change in the country are the people who cover it for a living in Washington. And that's not good for the Democrats.
Right, yeah.
Unless Trump has completely screwed up to the point where what we're going to do is have...
Where anybody could beat him, or your pet dog could beat him.
Where anybody could beat him. Well, beat J.D. Vance, not beat Donald Trump.
Right, got it. To your point, I don't know if you follow Nate Silver very closely, but he recently on his Substack had a mock Democratic nominee draft with his old comrade Galen Duke from 538. And so they, basically you could pick the field and, first round, second round. Galen Duke got the 1-1 choice, and his 1-1 choice was AOC. And Nate Silver said, hey, that was what I was going to do. So these are pretty astute political observers. And their view, and it's not crazy, is that when you look at the dynamics of a probable Democratic primary contest, and you look at where the energy is right now, and you look at what the views are of the people who are most active in the party, it seems quite plausible that this surprise left-wing candidate, again, maybe not to you or me, but to many other people, would come out of left field, so to speak, and actually run the table. I don't think that's... What about Josh Shapiro, though? He was the 1-2 choice. He was the first round, second choice. So tell me why he can't do the job. Could he? Is he willing to sort of realize the situation we're in and sort of do what it takes to fend off someone like AOC or a similar candidate?
Well, you never want to say never. You're talking about, this is a campaign that will break out in earnest about 2 years from now, April of 2027. And then you'll have the fencing and the shadow boxing primary. The thing, I look at Josh Shapiro and I think, which Democratic voter faction is going to get up in the morning and say, I've got to see Josh Shapiro as president? It's certainly
probably not your
any...
black moderates.
Well, that's actually my point, which is I can see a lot of people in the third way, turning around and saying, well, this is our guy. He's Jewish. He wins in swing states. He fits the model, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, that's the sort of person who thought John Glenn would be a great candidate in 1984. The problem was the candidate.
Right.
The candidate couldn't excite the voter. And I look and I say, okay, who is going to say, I've got to get me some more of that Josh Shapiro? And
so to
I
speak.
just think the sort of person in the center left is the sort of person who dreams that the West Wing was real, and that short of Josiah Bartlett, Pete Buttigieg is the guy. And I look and I think, okay, I don't think that's a majority, but that is a faction.
Hmm.
And there's the left, which wants to believe. Yeah, and the thing is, for my Republican friends who always say, well, the Democratic Party is so far left, they've left America, to use either Reagan's or I forget who said it in 1984. Maybe it was Gene Kirkpatrick. But, guess what? The Democratic left's own self history is basically we've been exiled since 1972.
Hmm.
And Obama betrayed us, Clinton betrayed us, Pelosi betrays us, Schumer betrays us. We would win if only we ran things. And somebody like AOC just feeds into that.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. I like that because I
And
think
so,
it's kind of like the German communists in the 30s. After Hitler, our turn. These guys are after Trump, our turn. Finally, we can seize power and make America, really.
so,
I don't know what
so really, I think what you should do is send AOC an autographed copy of the biography of Ernst Thälmann.
Exactly. Right. That's kind of a deep cut there for you out in podcast land, but that tickles my funny bone. Yeah. Ernst
Yeah, but
Thälmann, now
so
more
I
than
look at
ever.
this and I say, if AOC plays her card right, we know that the Sanders constituency is anywhere between 25 and 35% in a multi-candidate first-round race. We know that the center-left Josiah Bartlett constituency is like 20 to 25%. Well, that's 60%.
Hmm. Right.
And there's going to be multiple candidates. Do I think that there are enough white moderates and white conservatives? We know that like Latinos who vote in the Democratic primary tend left.
Right.
Where's
More
Josh
liberal. Yeah.
Shapiro's constituency? What saved Joe Biden was black voters.
Right. Exactly. Mm.
And so if you can tell me that Josh Shapiro can go to Atlanta and he can get people at the Ebenezer Baptist Church on board, that he can go into South Carolina in Orangeburg County and get people who love Jim Clyburn excited about him. Okay, well, I see that constituency. It wouldn't show up in New Hampshire, but it would show up elsewhere.
Hmm.
And but I don't see it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
again, I'm perfectly happy to let people mature and evolve and see how Josh Shapiro goes. But until you can show me that black moderate who can excite the Democratic moderate who can excite the black voter, given who else is likely to be in the race and their strengths,
Right.
I just think this is another case of Washington drinking its own Kool-Aid, and they'll be shocked when it turns out that it doesn't pack the punch they thought it did.
Okay. Well, last item here before we sign off. I've taken enough of your valuable time. I want that great brain to be back working on the populist issue. What about Cory Booker? I mean, isn't that someone who could excite the black moderate?
And there you go. Is that Cory Booker? You take a look at the early polls are taken with a grain of salt as predictive value, but they don't mean nothing. And what we know is that Cory Booker's 25-hour filibuster has allowed him to have what he did not have in 2020, which is some degree of national awareness. Could Cory Booker combine Democratic center leftism with an appeal to the black community to be that candidate? Maybe. I'd rather be Cory Booker than Josh Shapiro right now.
Okay, that's a great place to end it now, because that's a very provocative and interesting observation. So, out there in podcast land, start making your bets on the Democratic nominee. There's a lot that's going to go under the bridge before then, but I think we've given you some things to think about in terms of where to place your bets. And I want to thank you, Henry, for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And, come on by AEI and I'll buy you lunch.
Hey, let's make it a date. I am happy to always come by AEI and happy to break bread with you, my friend.
Excellent. Excellent.